I rented the cabin on a last-minute trip to Arizona, hoping to escape the noise and mess of city life for a few days. It was a small place tucked away in the desert, isolated enough that you could feel like you owned the whole world. The sun baked the ground during the day, and the nights were cold and quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your own breathing and heartbeat feel loud. The cabin itself was old, built from wood that had weathered the years into a dusty brown color, with a small porch out front and a back door that led to the desert scrub. The windows were dusty but clear enough to let in the light. Inside, there was a small living room with a couch and a worn rug, a tiny kitchen with an old stove, and a bedroom with a bed covered by a thin blanket. It felt simple and honest, the kind of place where you expected things to stay still, where nothing unusual happened. The first night, I locked the back door before going to bed. The lock was old but sturdy, a metal latch that clicked firmly into place. I made sure the door was shut tight. I felt a little silly, locking up when I was alone out here, but something about being in the desert made me want to be extra careful. Outside, the stars were bright, and the silence was total. The next morning, when I got up, the back door was open. Not wide open like it had been left swinging, but cracked just enough to see the dark gap between the door and the frame. I froze for a moment, staring at it. I had locked it before going to bed. I was sure of it. I checked the latch and it wasn't broken. It looked like someone had simply opened it, then closed it again loosely. I looked outside. The ground was hard and dry, the sand packed tight. There were no footprints near the door, no marks or signs that anyone had been there. The wind was calm. There was no breeze to push the door open. It didn't make any sense. Feeling uneasy, I closed the door and locked it again, testing the latch to make sure it held. Then I went about my morning, trying to ignore the chill that crept up my spine. That day, I spent time exploring the area around the cabin. The desert stretched for miles, covered in low bushes and jagged rocks. I walked along some dusty paths, watched the lizards dart under stones, and felt the sun scorch my skin. At night, I made a simple dinner and sat on the porch, listening to the desert's quiet hum. When I went to bed that night, I locked the back door carefully again. This time, I took an extra precaution. I found an old wooden chair in the corner of the room and jammed it under the doorknob, wedging it tight so the door couldn't be pushed open easily. In the morning, the door was wide open. The chair lay on its side, a few feet away from the door. I stood there, mouth dry, heart pounding. How was this happening? No footprints, no broken lock, nothing disturbed besides the chair and the door. I examined the door frame and the lock again. Everything was intact. No signs of forced entry. The window beside the door was closed and locked too. It felt impossible. There was no way anyone could have gotten in or out without leaving a trace. For the next 2 days, I kept repeating the same routine. Lock the door, wedge the chair, check everything twice. Every morning, the door was open again. Sometimes just a crack, sometimes all the way wide. Each time, the chair was moved or tipped over. No footprints outside, no disturbed dirt or sand. I didn't tell anyone. I felt embarrassed, like maybe I was losing my mind, but the feeling of being watched or that something had entered the cabin wouldn't go away. At night, I left the lights on longer than usual. I stayed awake for a while, listening for any sounds outside, but the desert remained silent except for the occasional rustle of a small animal. On the 4th morning, I woke up early, still tired from a restless night. When I looked at the pillow beside me, something caught my eye. A small, dry twig lay neatly placed on the pillowcase. It wasn't there when I went to sleep. The twig was thin and brittle, covered in tiny cracks like it had been baked by the desert sun. I picked it up slowly, turning it over in my fingers. How had it gotten inside? The back door was locked tight when I went to bed. I hadn't heard anyone come in or out. I looked around the room carefully. No other signs, no footprints. Nothing moved except the chair, which was still under the door this time. I felt a cold weight in my chest. It was clear now that whatever was happening wasn't random. Someone or something was coming into the cabin during the night. But how? And why leave a twig? I spent the day trying to think it through. The desert was isolated, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. There was no road close enough for a car to sneak in quietly. No signs of animals big enough to move the door or chair. No wind strong enough to open the door that much without slamming it. It was too strange. At night, I decided not to wedge the chair. I locked the door as usual, then placed a heavy box in front of it. If the door opened, the box would have to move or fall. I lay awake, staring at the door, listening hard. The desert outside was dark and still. Hours passed. Around 2 a.m., I heard a faint sound, like soft scraping, a faint shuffling just outside the door. My heart jumped. I held my breath and watched. Slowly, the door creaked open, pushing against the box. The box shifted a little but didn't fall. Then the door stopped moving. I stayed still, waiting, sweat breaking out on my forehead. After a moment, the door closed again, just as quietly as it had opened. I checked the box, it had barely moved. I looked for footprints, but there were none. No signs of disturbance. I realized then that whoever or whatever was opening the door was careful, silent, light on their feet. The next morning, I didn't find anything new on the pillow, but the door was open again. The box was slightly moved, but still in place. I was scared now, but also curious. I knew I couldn't stay much longer, but I had to understand what was going on. On the last night, I set a small camera by the door. It was an old phone with a motion sensor app, set to record anything moving near the door. I locked the door, placed the box in front, and went to bed, heart thudding. I woke up early, grabbed the phone, and checked the video. The screen showed nothing at first, just the dark outline of the door frame. Then, just before 2 a.m., the door handle turned slowly, and the door creaked open, but no one entered. A pair of hands appeared, thin, gloved hands, reaching through the crack. They slipped inside, dropped something on the floor, then pulled back and closed the door. The camera caught it all clearly. I hurried outside and looked on the ground near the door. There, in the dirt, was a small bundle of dry twigs, tied together with a thin string. I realized it was some kind of signal or warning, but from whom or what, I couldn't say. The gloved hands suggested it wasn't an animal. Someone was sneaking in quietly, leaving signs without entering fully. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I called the rental company to tell them about the door, but they said no one had been in or out except cleaning staff a week before my arrival. When I checked the area one last time, I found faint tire tracks far off the dirt road leading to the cabin. Fresh but old enough to be missed if you didn't look closely. I never found out who or what was behind those open doors and the twigs on my pillow, but I know now that some things are better left unexplained. The desert had kept its secret, and I was lucky to get away without seeing it face to face. Before I even booked the place, the host seemed careful. The listing was for a quiet cottage tucked into the hills of rural Vermont. It looked cozy, with stove, big windows, pine beams across the ceiling. It felt like a good escape from everything. I'd had a hard year. Work stress, a breakup, just too many things pressing in from all sides. I needed somewhere quiet to think, maybe write a little, maybe just sleep without city noise creeping in through the windows. Vermont in the fall sounded like peace. The host messaged me shortly after I sent my request. They said the cottage was older, built in the 1950s, but solid. For safety and clarity, they attached a PDF of the floor plan, which I thought was a little unusual but also reassuring in its own way. I opened it up, simple layout. Living room with a fireplace, a kitchen at the back, one bedroom, a small bathroom, and a hallway that ran through the middle. There was a closet and a small utility area labeled near the hallway. That was it. I didn't see anything odd. I booked it for 5 nights, long enough to settle in a little, but not too long in case it was one of those places where the photos were better than reality. The drive up from Boston was calm. A little over 4 hours, winding roads, the leaves just past peak color. I stopped for gas at a tiny station where the pump still had the old flip-style numbers. Felt like stepping back in time. The cottage was at the end of a long dirt road, barely wide enough for my car. There were no other houses in view. Forest pressed in tight on both sides. The cottage looked just like the pictures, maybe a little better. The shingles were weathered but intact, the chimney puffing a thin line of smoke. It was cool that day, not freezing, but you could feel the cold hanging around the edges of everything. Inside, it smelled faintly like cedar and old paper, the kind of dry, quiet air you only find in places that have been around a long time. Everything was neat. The furniture was simple, clean, and older. Nothing fancy. The bed was made with a quilt that looked handmade. There was a binder on the coffee table with check-in instructions, emergency contacts, and a hand-drawn map of the property lines. I remembered the floor plan and decided to walk through the space to get my bearings. Everything was as I'd expected, mostly. Living room, small dining area beside the kitchen, hallway to the bedroom and bathroom. But something stopped me as I passed the hallway. On the left side, about halfway down, was a panel in the wall. It was wood, same as the rest of the walls, but the grain didn't line up. It looked like a door, only it had no handle, no hinges showing. It wasn't in the floor plan. I pulled out my phone, brought up the PDF again, and double-checked. Nothing. The spot where the panel was supposed to be was blank wall. I even tapped the spot. It was hollow behind it, but solid. It didn't move when I pushed on it. I figured maybe it was just an old sealed-up closet or something. Old houses do weird things. That night was quiet. I lit the fire, made some pasta, opened a book I'd been meaning to read for months. Around 9 or 10, I heard what I thought was a branch hitting the roof, but the wind was calm. Nothing to worry about. I went to bed early. The second day passed slowly. I took a walk up the road, found a trail that led into the woods, but didn't go too far. I'm not much of a hiker. I just needed the air. Back at the house, I noticed again how silent everything was. Not the kind of silence you get in suburbs. This was real silence. No cars, no voices, no humming appliances. I started to notice my own breathing, the creak of the floorboards under my feet, the way the walls settled, and that panel in the hallway, the not-a-door door, it started to feel bigger than it was, like it was part of the room in a way that I couldn't stop thinking about. I knocked on it, just a few soft knocks, hollow like I thought, but solid. No echo from beyond, no air moving through cracks, just the muted thud of old wood. That night, just before falling asleep, I heard something, a soft scrape, like someone dragging a socked foot across wood. I sat up, waited, nothing else. It was the kind of sound you try to explain away. Pipes settling, the fire shrinking in the stove. But the fire was already out, and the sound came again, closer this time. I got out of bed, opened the door to the hallway, and stood there. Nothing, no sound now, just cold air. I checked the panel, still shut, still flush with the wall. The third night is when it got worse. I woke up around 2:30, just out of nowhere, not from a dream, not from any noise that I remembered. I lay there for a minute, not moving, listening, and then I heard it. Footsteps, from inside the wall, slow, uneven, not walking across the floor, but from behind the wall where that panel was, like someone pacing a narrow space. For steps, then a pause, then for more steps. I sat up in bed, every hair standing up. My chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath for too long. I got up. I walked down the hall, keeping my eyes on that panel the whole time. The steps stopped when I got closer. It was just quiet, but the kind of quiet that hums in your ears because your body knows something isn't right. I stood in front of the panel and listened. No sound now. I touched it. Cold. Solid. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed on the couch with the lights on, facing the hallway. In the morning, everything felt normal again. Too normal. The sun was shining through the windows. The stove still had some warmth in it. I tried to convince myself it was animals, maybe raccoons in the walls. Maybe the house was built weird and sound traveled through the walls from outside. But I'd seen no signs of animals. No scratching, no chewing, just footsteps. Footsteps too slow, too heavy for a raccoon or a squirrel. I didn't want to stay a fourth night, but part of me felt like leaving would be giving in to fear. I tried to go about the day. I read, I walked, I made dinner early. I checked the panel again. No change. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go to bed. I sat in the armchair by the fire, watching the hallway. The hours passed slowly. Midnight, 1 a.m., nothing. Around 3, I felt cold suddenly, like someone had opened a window, but all the windows were closed. I got up, crept down the hallway again. That's when I saw it. The panel wasn't flush with the wall anymore. It was open, just an inch, not wide, not enough to see inside, but enough that I could see a sliver of black space. And just as I was stepping closer, I saw it movement, a shape, and an eye. One single eye, unmoving, staring out at me through the crack. I backed away slowly. My whole body went stiff. I can't explain how long I stood there. Maybe 10 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. Then I turned and left. I grabbed my coat, my keys, my boots, and I walked out the front door and didn't stop until I was sitting in my car. I didn't drive off. I just sat there. I left the lights off. I could see the front of the cottage from the car. The windows dark. Nothing moved. I stayed out there until the sun came up. At first light, I went back inside, packed everything I could in 10 minutes, and left without looking down the hallway again. I didn't even close the door behind me. I didn't care. I reported it to Airbnb. I told them there was a discrepancy in the layout and that someone might have been in the walls. I didn't go into full detail. What was I supposed to say? There was an eye watching me through a secret door? They told me they'd follow up with the host. I never heard back. Weeks later, I kept checking the listing. It disappeared. Removed entirely. I still think about it. Not every day, but often enough. I keep asking myself what was behind that door. Who built that part of the house? Why didn't the host include it in the floor plan? It wasn't a ghost. I know that. It wasn't some fantasy horror movie monster. It was a person. Someone was behind that wall, living in the dark, watching, and they waited until the third night to let me know they were there. I rented a small guest house just outside Salem, Massachusetts, for a week. It was the kind of place you'd find on Airbnb, cozy, quiet, and tucked away on a narrow, tree-lined street. The kind of spot perfect for a break from the city noise and to get some work done. I was supposed to be here for a mix of work and a little downtime, away from the usual distractions. The house was old but well kept, with creaky wooden floors, low ceilings, and lots of windows that let in natural light during the day. It had a simple, vintage vibe, like something out of an old movie, but without anything too creepy or unusual about it. The owner was friendly and gave clear instructions about the Wi-Fi, parking, and how to use the heating. The first few days went by without much trouble. I worked on my laptop in the small living room, brewed coffee in the tiny kitchen, and went for walks around the neighborhood. Felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. There wasn't much of a neighborhood vibe either. Mostly just a few houses spread out and lots of woods beyond the street. The only odd thing was the spotty cell service, which made me rely on Wi-Fi for calls and messages. One afternoon, about 2 days into my stay, I was on a video call with a friend back home. We were catching up, talking about work and life. That's when I first noticed something strange. During the call, I heard a faint sound in the background, like a quiet, muffled voice. It was so low that I wasn't sure if it was coming through my friend's end or mine. I asked if they heard anything, but they said no. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just interference from the Wi-Fi or my phone acting up. Later that evening, I tested it again on another call. This time, I used the speakerphone and stayed silent to listen closely. The faint sound was definitely there, but it was distorted, like someone whispering far away or a bad recording playing under the conversation. I felt a little weirded out, but didn't want to jump to conclusions. Phones and Wi-Fi often do strange things in older houses, especially ones with thick walls and a mix of old wiring. Curious, I started recording some video calls to listen back later. When I played the recordings, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Beneath my own voice, there was a faint repetition of things I had said earlier in the house, almost like an echo, but not just an echo. It was my own voice playing back in broken, jumbled fragments. Phrases I had said hours ago, sometimes sentences from conversations I remembered, Other times things I had forgotten or didn't think I said out loud. It was subtle, but as the days passed, it got harder to ignore. The more I listened, the more I noticed these little snippets of audio mixed in with the calls. It was like the house had recorded me somehow and was playing back pieces of my own conversations over and over. But that made no sense. There were no obvious recording devices anywhere that I could find. The guest house wasn't modern or high-tech. There was a basic smart thermostat, a couple of smart light bulbs in the living room, and a small smart speaker in the kitchen that the owner said was for playing music only. I didn't even use the smart speaker much. It was unplugged most of the time. One evening, I decided to dig deeper. I walked through the house, checking every room for devices or anything unusual. I looked behind furniture, inside drawers, in the corners of the ceiling, even in the attic space above the ceiling panels. There was nothing out of place. No hidden cameras, no strange gadgets. Nothing that could explain how my voice was being recorded and replayed. Feeling frustrated, I finally unplugged every smart device in the house. The thermostat, the light bulbs, and the speaker. I even turned off my phone's Wi-Fi and restarted it. But the strange sounds didn't stop. Each night, when I was alone, I could hear faint murmurs coming from the speaker, or sometimes from my phone itself when I tried to make calls or use voice apps. It wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was clearly my own voice, sounding distant, overlapping, like a half-remembered conversation looping in the background. One night, the strangest thing happened. I was on a call with my best friend, who was checking in on me. I was explaining what was going on, trying to sound calm. Suddenly, she stopped me mid-sentence and said, "Why do you sound like you're talking over someone whispering? It's really weird." That freaked me out because I had been hearing those whispers for days, but I never thought someone else could hear them on the other end. After that, I started recording everything: calls, video chats, even just voice memos to myself. When I played them back, the strange echoes and overlays were always there. Sometimes, I could even hear parts of conversations I hadn't remembered having, words I didn't think I said aloud. It was like the house had a memory of me, a secret playback system, but no visible way to do it. I talked to the owner about it, explaining what I was hearing and experiencing. He looked puzzled but said the guest house was old and didn't have any special electronics except the smart devices I'd unplugged. He assured me no one else had been in the house since the last guest, and there was no reason for any recording devices to be installed. He suggested it might be a problem with my phone or an app glitch. I tried using a different phone, borrowing one from a neighbor nearby. The same thing happened. The faint audio traces of my own voice kept appearing on calls and recordings. It was the same with my laptop's microphone during video chats. I even swapped out SIM cards and Wi-Fi routers, thinking maybe some interference was causing strange feedback loops. The more I tried to fix it, the worse it felt. It was as if the house itself was somehow capturing snippets of my speech and playing them back in distorted form. At night, when I was alone, the effect was strongest. I could hear low murmurs from the unplugged smart speaker's speakers, even though it was powered off. Sometimes the sounds seemed to come from the walls or the old wooden floorboards. It was hard to tell. Sleep became difficult. I started keeping a notebook next to my bed, writing down every strange sound I heard, every phrase I thought I recognized in the background noise. It was exhausting. I even tried recording my sleep with a voice-activated recorder. The playback captured my own voice, quiet and distant, but speaking words I never remembered saying. One night, I woke up to a very clear phrase in my own voice, spoken softly but distinctly, coming from the hallway. It said, "Are you still awake?" My heart pounded. I got up and checked every room. No one was there. The smart devices were still unplugged. My phone was off the charger in the kitchen. I was alone. After that night, I finally made a decision to leave early. I packed up my things and called the owner to explain I had to cut my stay short because of some weird technical issues. He seemed sympathetic but didn't have any explanation. Before I left, I took one last walk through the house and the yard, trying to clear my head. Driving away, I kept thinking about what had happened. How could my voice be recorded and played back like that without any visible device? No cameras, no microphones, no gadgets. I remembered the old wiring in the house, how the phone lines were connected through old copper cables that sometimes made crackling noises on calls. Maybe some kind of interference was creating a strange audio loop, mixing my voice signals and playing them back through the speakers in distorted ways. I thought about the internet router, too. Maybe a hacked router or a bug in the smart devices was recording voice data and replaying it unintentionally. But even unplugging everything didn't stop it. Maybe the wiring was so old and mixed up that it created feedback loops through the power lines or phone lines, echoing voices from earlier in the day. At the end of the day, I never found a clear answer. I couldn't prove anything, and no one else seemed to experience it. But one thing I knew for sure was that the house was somehow capturing my voice and replaying parts of it back to me. It wasn't ghosts or supernatural stuff, just an odd, real-world tech or wiring problem that made the house sound like it was talking to itself, or more accurately, to me, in strange and unsettling ways. I still have the recordings saved on my laptop. Whenever I listen to them now, I hear my own voice overlapping, repeating bits of conversations I can't remember. It's unnerving, but I've learned to accept it as just one of those weird things that sometimes happen in old houses with old technology. After all, some places just have their own way of making you feel uneasy, even if it's just through a broken wire or a malfunctioning speaker. I won't be going back to that guest house anytime soon, and I always make sure to check the wiring and devices carefully whenever I stay somewhere new now, because sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the glitches and echoes of our own voices, trapped in the walls, reminding us that some places remember us more than we expect. When I first found the Airbnb listing in Atlanta, it looked perfect. The photos showed a bright, clean, modern flat, all white walls and large windows letting in natural light. The furniture was stylish and matched perfectly. There was a sleek couch, a nice dining table, and even some plants. It felt like a place I'd want to stay in, comfortable and safe. I was traveling alone for a few days to visit some friends and explore the city, so I wanted something that felt like a home away from home. The price was reasonable too, so I booked it without thinking twice. The day I arrived, I took an Uber from the airport. The neighborhood seemed normal enough. Quiet streets, a few people walking dogs, some small shops and cafes nearby. When I reached the building, it was an older brick apartment complex. Nothing fancy, but not run down either. I had the host's instructions on how to get the key from a lockbox at the entrance, so I wasn't worried. But the moment I stepped inside the flat, everything was off. The bright, modern place from the pictures was nowhere to be found. The hallway was dim. The walls looked yellowed and stained in some spots. The floor was covered in worn-out carpet that had clearly seen better days. I flicked on the light switches, but only one small overhead light worked, casting more shadows than light. The furniture was a strange mix of mismatched old pieces. A sagging floral couch that smelled faintly of smoke, a cracked coffee table with peeling paint, a dining table with one chair missing and the other two wobbly. There were no plants or decorations anywhere. The kitchen counters were cluttered with dirty dishes and leftover food crumbs, the sink full of unwashed plates and glasses. The fridge hummed loudly, but inside, it was empty except for a few half-empty condiments. I opened the cabinets. Some had chipped plates and mugs, others were empty or had cans with expired dates. The bathroom was just as bad. The shower curtain was stained, the tiles had mold around the edges, and the half-used bottles of shampoo and soap looked like they had been there for weeks. The towels on the rack were thin and scratchy. The mirror above the sink had a crack running through the corner. The whole place felt neglected, like no one had bothered to clean it in a long time. I moved into the bedroom and found an unmade bed with crumpled sheets that smelled musty. There were clothes tossed on the floor, and a pair of old shoes shoved under the bed. On the bedside table, I noticed a few personal items. A pair of reading glasses, a half-empty bottle of water, and some papers that looked like bills or mail. It didn't feel like a guest had just left. It felt like someone still lived here, or at least had been here very recently. I pulled out my phone to message the host. I told them the place didn't match the photos at all and asked if this was the correct apartment. They replied quickly, saying the photos were from before the tenant moved out. That didn't make sense to me, because the place didn't look like it had been cleaned or prepared for a new guest. It looked exactly like someone was still living there or had just left in a hurry. I started to look around more carefully. There were little things that didn't add up. A half-eaten sandwich in the kitchen trash, a pack of cigarettes on the windowsill, and a used toothbrush in a cup next to the sink. I checked the fridge again and found a few empty beer bottles behind the milk carton. The TV was dusty and covered in fingerprints, but it was plugged in and turned on to a paused show. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the floor near the entrance to the living room, a picture frame was smashed, glass shattered and lying face down. I carefully moved it aside and looked at the photo inside. It was a recent family picture. A man, a woman, and 2 kids, all smiling at the camera in a park. The photo looked new, the colors still bright and sharp. This picture was definitely not part of the listing photos. The air in the flat felt heavy, like I was intruding on someone's private life. I felt uneasy, like I was being watched even though I was alone. The idea that the host had lied about the place was unsettling enough, but the presence of personal belongings, dirty dishes, and that broken photo made me question everything. I decided to explore the place more to see if I could find anything else. In one of the drawers in the living room, I found some papers, bills addressed to the same family in the photo with recent dates. A calendar on the fridge had appointments written in pen, all within the past few weeks. It was clear this wasn't an abandoned flat, and it wasn't ready for guests. I went back to the host and told them again I wanted to leave. I asked for a refund, explaining that the place was not as advertised and unsafe to stay in. The host was slow to respond and kept insisting the photos were old and that the tenant had moved out. But I knew that wasn't true. By that point, I didn't want to stay another minute. I grabbed my bags and left the apartment, locking the door behind me. The building's lobby was empty and quiet, and I waited for an Uber outside, feeling a knot of anxiety in my chest. I felt relieved to be out of that place, but I couldn't shake the image of that broken photo and the feeling that someone might come back at any moment. I found another Airbnb nearby, this time a real one, clean, bright, and ready for guests. The difference was night and day. I reported the fake listing to Airbnb, sharing all the photos and messages. Took a while, but the listing was eventually taken down. Looking back, I realize how easily things can go wrong when you trust what you see online. That experience taught me to always double-check reviews, ask detailed questions, and trust my instincts. There are places out there that look perfect online but hide uncomfortable truths behind closed doors. I'm glad I got out when I did, but the memory of that dirty, dim flat with someone's life still left behind stays with me. It's a reminder that not every place is what it seems, and sometimes you need to be ready to walk away for your own safety. I rented a quiet little place outside of Asheville, North Carolina, for a week's getaway from the city. The listing promised peace, fresh air, and a chance to unwind somewhere off the beaten path. It was an old farmhouse converted into an Airbnb, sitting on a good-sized wooded lot far enough from the road that all I could hear was the rustle of the trees and birds in the morning. The pictures showed a charming, rustic home with a wraparound porch, wooden floors, and big windows looking out into the forest. It looked perfect for the kind of rest I needed. When I arrived, the host met me briefly to hand over the keys and gave me a quick rundown. They seemed friendly but a little distracted. They told me to enjoy the place and mentioned there was a basement laundry room for guests to use. That was good because I hadn't packed much, planning to wash clothes while I was there. The first day went smoothly. I unpacked, explored the small property, and spent the afternoon sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the quiet hum of nature. The house itself was old but well maintained. The floors creaked in the way old wooden floors do, and the walls had that dry, dusty smell you expect from places that have been around for a while. The kitchen had a farmhouse sink and old-fashioned cabinets, and the bathroom had a clawfoot tub that looked barely used. Everything was simple but comfortable. It felt like the kind of place where you could settle in and slow down for a while. The basement was a concrete foundation with a laundry area in one corner. There was a washer and dryer that looked a little old but still worked fine. The basement had bare concrete floors and exposed pipes running along the ceiling. The walls were mostly stone and concrete, with patches of peeling paint. There was one strange feature, though. On one wall, there was a heavy-looking door set into the foundation. It was made of thick wood, with a rusted metal padlock hanging on a hasp. The door didn't look like it led anywhere useful. It was just built right into the wall, as if it was meant to cover some kind of hidden room or cellar. I noticed it right away when I went down to do laundry the first time. What caught my eye more than the door itself were the marks around it. Near the bottom of the door frame, on the inside of the wall, there were scratches, deep and jagged, like someone or something had been clawing at it. The marks looked old but fresh enough to be unsettling. They were too deliberate to be random damage from settling or animals. I stopped and stared for a few minutes, feeling a little uneasy but telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe some previous tenant had stored something behind there or tried to break in. Still, I didn't feel comfortable going near it, so I just left it alone. That night, I was sitting in the living room reading when I started hearing something strange. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a branch hitting the house. But the noise didn't sound natural. It was soft, rhythmic banging, coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Then, underneath the banging, I started hearing something else. A faint whispering, almost like a voice. The sound was too soft to make out words clearly, but it was definitely a voice. It didn't sound like anything normal. The whispers were desperate, and the banging continued as if whatever was making it was trying to get out. I froze, my heart racing. I sat very still and listened, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the noises went on for several minutes, then stopped suddenly. The silence afterward was even worse because it made me question if I had really heard anything at all. The next day, I tried to avoid going into the basement, but I needed to do laundry again. I forced myself to go down, keeping my eyes away from that locked door. But when I got near the laundry machines, I noticed the scratches again. This time, they seemed fresher, sharper, like something had been scraping at the door more recently. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I took a quick photo and messaged the host, asking what was behind the door and if it was safe. It wasn't long before the host replied. Their message was short and clear. "That door's not for guests. Please don't go near it again." I stared at the message on my phone, the unease growing. The host didn't explain anything else. No reason, no apology, nothing. Just that warning. That night, I heard the noises again. The soft banging beneath the floorboards, the whispered pleas, the desperate scratching. I didn't sleep well at all. I kept thinking about that door and the marks on it. What was behind it? Why had the host told me not to go near it? And what was making those noises? Over the next few days, I stayed away from the basement as much as I could. I did laundry only once more, quickly and with the lights on, not looking anywhere but at the machines. Each time I passed that door, I felt a tightening in my chest, a mix of fear and curiosity. I even thought about calling local authorities, but I didn't want to seem crazy or cause trouble over something I couldn't prove. One afternoon, as I was packing to leave early, I found a small notebook tucked away behind some firewood in the corner of the basement. It wasn't locked or hidden, but it seemed placed carefully out of sight. The notebook was old and covered in dust. I flipped through it and found notes written in rough handwriting, dated back several years. The entries talked about the farmhouse's history. It had once been a place where a man lived alone, someone who was known in the small community but kept to himself mostly. The man had been ill, severely ill, and there were mentions of him being confined to a room in the basement by family members or caretakers. The notes hinted at strange sounds and unexplained noises coming from the basement during that time. There were also warnings scribbled in the margins. "Don't open the locked door," "He's still there," and "The scratching never stopped." My skin crawled as I read the last few pages. They suggested that the man had passed away in that basement room, but something about the way it was written felt off. Like the writer wasn't sure if he was truly gone. I closed the notebook, my hands shaking. I left the farmhouse immediately after that. On the drive away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was watching me from that old house. The woods seemed darker, the silence heavier. I didn't look back once. I reported the place to Airbnb, explaining what I found and the strange noises. They took the complaint seriously and removed the listing. The host never contacted me again. In the end, the farmhouse was just a quiet old place with a locked door no one was meant to open. But the sounds beneath the floorboards and the desperate scratching told a different story. Whatever was behind that door had been trapped, trying to escape, for years. And maybe, somehow, it still was. It was late October when I decided I needed to get away from everything. Work, noise, people. I'd been stretched thin for months, running on autopilot, and it was starting to show. So I took a week off, booked a remote cabin in the Utah mountains through Airbnb, and told no one where I was going except my boss. I didn't want to deal with texts or calls or the obligations that came with being reachable. I just wanted to sit with silence. The cabin was exactly how it had been listed: rustic, remote, and surrounded by nothing but tall pines and rocky trails. The drive up had been rough. The road turned from gravel to rutted dirt about 3 miles from the property, and the cell signal dropped completely once I passed the last turnoff. The place didn't have Wi-Fi either, but that was the point. I wasn't there to scroll through my phone. I was there to breathe, read, and maybe hike a little if the weather held. When I arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains. The last slant of orange light filtered through the trees as I parked my car on the gravel patch out front. The cabin was small, maybe 500 square feet, built of old timber with a porch barely big enough to fit one chair. The inside was simple: one room with a bed, a small kitchen, and a living area. A narrow door led to the bathroom. Everything smelled like wood and dust, the kind of musty scent that never quite goes away in old places, but it wasn't unpleasant, just old. There was no lock on the bedroom door, just a sliding bolt on the outside of the front door. That didn't bother me at first. This wasn't the kind of place people stumbled across. It was buried deep in a forest and probably hadn't seen neighbors in years. The host had left a binder on the table with a few notes about how to light the pilot on the stove, how to reset the circuit if I blew a fuse, and a handwritten message that said, "Enjoy your stay. There's firewood stacked behind the cabin and a backup flashlight in the drawer by the sink." That first evening was uneventful. I made a can of soup on the stove, read a few chapters from a book, and fell asleep early. It was dead quiet outside. No wind, no birds, just the creaks and sighs of the old cabin as it settled. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of water running. It was quick, maybe 5 or 6 seconds, and then I clearly heard a toilet flush. I lay still in bed, trying to make sense of it. I figured the pipes were just making noise. The cabin was old, probably hadn't been used in a while. Pipes sometimes do that. Maybe it was just the water tank refilling or something. It didn't make sense, but I didn't dwell on it. I was too tired to get up and check, so I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the property. There was a small trail that led downhill toward a creek, maybe half a mile away. The air was crisp and cold. I didn't see any animals, just some birds hopping from branch to branch, but the woods felt dense, like they were holding their breath. I spent most of the day outside, bundled up in layers, drinking coffee from a thermos and sitting on a flat rock overlooking the water. It was peaceful, and I started to feel like I was finally relaxing. That night, I cooked something simple and turned in early again. Nothing strange happened. No weird sounds. Just the occasional groan of the floorboards and the distant hoot of an owl somewhere out past the trees. I slept well. The next morning, I made coffee and started tidying up a bit, just to keep the place from getting messy. That's when I found the receipt. It was crumpled and shoved halfway under the fruit bowl on the counter. I probably wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't been wiping crumbs. I smoothed it out. It was from a gas station about 40 miles south, dated 2 days before I got there. The name on the receipt was Tyler B. I don't know anyone named Tyler. I figured maybe it was the host, but the name on the Airbnb listing had been Karen. I looked through the welcome binder again. Her name was on the handwritten note too. Nothing about a co-owner or manager. It was a little weird, but not necessarily alarming. Maybe someone had stayed before me and the place hadn't been cleaned very thoroughly. Still, it left me with a strange feeling. I couldn't shake it even as I folded the receipt and stuck it in the trash. That day, I went for a longer hike, trying to take my mind off it. The woods were so quiet they almost didn't feel real. No wind, no bugs, just the crunch of my boots on leaves and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the trees behind me, but when I stopped and looked around, there was nothing, just empty forest. I told myself I was being paranoid. Too many horror movies, maybe. Too much time in my own head. I made it back to the cabin just before sunset and sat on the porch for a while, watching the light fade through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But again, I chalked it up to nerves. I'd been in cities too long. Silence like this could start to mess with your mind. That night was different. I went to bed around 10, bundled up in blankets. It was colder now, probably in the 30s outside. I left the small space heater on low, just enough to keep the chill out. Around 3 a.m., I woke up, not from a sound this time, but from a smell. Cigarette smoke. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. I've never smoked a day in my life, and I didn't bring anything with me that would have that smell. I sat up slowly, my heart already starting to pound. The cabin was dark. I hadn't left any lights on, but that smell, it was getting stronger. Not choking, but enough to make my nose wrinkle. I listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No wind. No creaking from the walls. Just the hum of the space heater. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and grabbed the flashlight from the drawer. I didn't turn it on right away. I just stood in the darkness, trying to make out any shapes, any movement. Still nothing. The smell lingered for a few more minutes and then slowly faded. I finally turned on the flashlight and checked every inch of the cabin. Nothing was out of place. The doors were still locked. The windows all shut. No sign of anyone. But that didn't mean anything. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the corner of the room with my back to the wall, flashlight in one hand, my small camping knife in the other. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there. Not a ghost, not something made up. A real person, someone who'd been inside that cabin before and maybe never left. The first light, I started packing. I didn't shower. I didn't eat. I shoved everything into my duffel and double-checked every pocket and corner to make sure I hadn't left anything. The air outside was freezing, and my breath came out in white clouds as I tossed my gear in the car. Before I left, I circled the cabin one more time. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd find something. Footprints, cigarette butts, a clue that someone had been there. But the ground was dry, covered in pine needles and old leaves. No sign of anyone. As I rounded the back of the cabin, I noticed the cellar door. I hadn't seen it before. It was low to the ground, made of old wood with a rusty padlock on it. The kind of door that blended into the cabin siding unless you were looking right at it. My stomach dropped. There'd been no mention of a basement in the listing. Nothing in the binder. I stood there for a long minute, just staring at it. I didn't try the lock. I didn't want to know. I got in the car and started the engine. The tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I just kept driving until I hit pavement again, and even then I didn't stop. Not until I was almost halfway back to the city. Later, I left a review on the listing, but I kept it vague. Said the cabin was fine, but that I'd cut my trip short due to personal reasons. I didn't want to start something. I didn't want someone asking me why I really left. And truthfully, I didn't have any proof. Just a receipt, a smell, a door I hadn't noticed. I didn't want to go back there. But the whole experience stayed with me. Not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. Because of what might have happened if I'd stayed another night. Whoever Tyler was, whatever the smoke meant, whether someone had been hiding down there or not, I'll never know. But I trusted my gut that morning. I didn't wait around to see if it was all just my imagination. Some people need closure, answers. I don't. I got out. That's all that mattered. I booked a short trip to Portland last fall. I was working remotely and thought a change of scenery might help with the burnout. I found this Airbnb listed as a chic industrial loft in the heart of the city. The pictures looked great. Exposed brick walls, high ceilings, a big window that poured in natural light, and a minimalist interior with modern touches. What caught my eye the most was the huge mirror across from the bed. It stretched from almost floor to ceiling and had a thick black frame around it. It gave the place a nice balance, made the small space look bigger. The check-in was contactless. I got a code for the keypad and let myself in around 5 p.m. It was quiet, clean, and a little colder than I expected, but otherwise looked just like the photos. There was a faint chemical smell, maybe cleaning products, but nothing overwhelming. I tossed my bag on the bed and opened the windows for a bit to air the place out. The first night was uneventful. I grabbed dinner at a food cart pod a few blocks away, came back, took a shower, and worked a bit before getting into bed. The mirror across from me caught my attention again while I was lying there. It was big, probably 6 feet tall and at least 4 feet wide. I remember thinking it was kind of weird to have a mirror that size directly across from a bed. I'm not superstitious or anything, but the placement felt intentional, almost like someone wanted to watch themselves or others sleep. But I brushed it off. Old buildings have quirks, and it was Portland. People love their vibes here. The second day was more of the same. I worked from a cafe, wandered around a bookstore, and walked through the Pearl District before heading back. I made myself a sandwich, watched something on Netflix, and went to bed early. That night I kept waking up, not from noise or dreams, just that weird sense of being watched. It wasn't paranoia exactly, more like this steady itch at the back of my brain that made it hard to relax. I kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting something to move in it. At one point, I sat up and just stared at my own reflection. Nothing odd about it. I looked tired, maybe a little pale from the cold light. I told myself I was just having one of those overthinking nights and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, while brushing my teeth, I stood in front of the mirror again. Something felt off about it. Not how I looked in it, but the mirror itself. The glass didn't feel like regular glass. It seemed too dark, almost like tinted windows in a car. And when I leaned closer, I noticed something strange. I exhaled onto the surface, expecting it to fog up like any normal mirror would. But nothing happened. No condensation, just cold, silent glass. I tried again, exhaling more forcefully. Still nothing. I stepped back, confused. Maybe it was treated glass or something decorative. But even then, it should have reacted to breath, right? Out of curiosity, I knocked on it lightly. It sounded hollow, not like a mirror hanging on drywall, but like there was open space behind it. I bent down and took my phone from the nightstand, turned on the flashlight, and shined it around the edges of the frame. The beam caught something like a small gap between the mirror and the wall. There was space back there. Not a lot, but enough to suggest it wasn't mounted flush against anything solid. My heart started beating faster, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Could have just been some weird construction quirk. Old buildings are full of those. Still, the curiosity wouldn't let go. I reached behind the mirror, feeling for any kind of latch or screw. It was held in place at 4 corners by small brackets, which weren't even screwed in that tightly, almost like they were meant to be removed easily. That was when the uneasiness fully set in. I stood there for a while, just holding my phone, the flashlight bouncing off the glass and brick walls. My brain kept going back to the sound, hollow, and the breath not fogging the surface. Eventually, I grabbed a butter knife from the kitchen drawer and slowly began prying at the brackets. They came off easier than I expected. When I had all 4 removed, I gently pulled the mirror away from the wall. It was heavier than it looked, but manageable. As I moved it aside, I felt cold air hit my face. Behind the mirror was a narrow, dark crawl space, maybe 2.5 feet wide, and just tall enough that someone could sit upright in it. The smell hit me immediately. Stale air, dust, and something faintly rotten, like old food left out too long. I shined my flashlight into the crawl space. The beam caught a tiny metal folding chair set up just a few feet inside. Around it were crumpled food wrappers, a couple of empty water bottles, and something that looked like a dirty blanket or old coat wadded up in the corner. I stood there frozen, breathing heavily. My hand was trembling, the light shaking slightly as it lit up the small space. No signs of anyone inside at the moment, but that wasn't what chilled me. It was the implication that someone had been in there. Someone had sat in that chair. Someone had eaten in there, just a few feet from where I slept. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest, and leaned the mirror carefully against the wall. There were no cameras I could see, no wires or holes. But still, why a crawl space behind the mirror? Why a chair? I went into the living area and sat on the couch for a while, trying to think straight. The longer I sat, the more the feeling of violation sunk in. Someone could have been watching me. Maybe not last night, maybe not recently, but at some point, someone sat behind that mirror and stared out. I opened the Airbnb app and messaged the host. I didn't accuse them of anything. I just asked politely what the crawl space behind the mirror was. I said I had found it while checking out the mirror's frame. The reply came back an hour later. "Oh, that's just an old construction feature. It's sealed on the other side. This building has a lot of weird quirks from its warehouse days. Totally safe though." I read the message a couple of times. It didn't sit right with me. Sealed from the other side? Then how did someone get in there? And why was there trash? I asked if they were sure no one had used it recently. No response. I waited another 2 hours. Nothing. I looked up the address and did some digging online. The building had been converted into apartments and short-term rentals about 5 years ago. It used to be a textile warehouse in the 40s and 50s. I even found a PDF of the building permits from the city's website. There were no mentions of crawl spaces or wall access in the renovation documents. By that point, it was getting dark outside. I had 2 nights left on the reservation, but I decided I wasn't going to stay there another second. I booked a hotel a few miles away and packed my stuff. I didn't bother trying to put the mirror back. I left it leaning where it was. As I was grabbing my backpack, I paused. Just one more look. I stepped back into the bedroom and shined my light into the crawl space again. Nothing had changed, but the feeling had. I no longer felt alone in the apartment. I left the key on the counter, took photos of the crawl space, the mirror, the chair, the wrappers, everything. Then I got in my rental car and drove straight to the hotel. That night, I lay in the hotel bed unable to sleep. Not because I felt unsafe anymore, but because I couldn't stop playing back every night I'd stayed in that loft. Every second I had spent lying on the bed, brushing my teeth, changing clothes. Someone might have been behind that mirror the whole time. Even if they weren't watching me live, maybe they had watched people before me. Maybe they left and came back between guests. I contacted Airbnb support the next morning and told them everything. I sent the photos, explained what I found, even included the message from the host. They thanked me for the report and said they would look into it, possibly sending someone to inspect the unit. A week later, I checked the listing out of curiosity. It had been removed. Whether temporarily or permanently, I don't know. The host's profile was still up, but with no listings. I never heard anything else from Airbnb. No follow-up, no explanation. I still think about it sometimes. I never saw a person. There was no dramatic reveal, no confrontation. But the fear that someone had been in the walls, watching, maybe waiting, is worse in a way. It wasn't ghosts or demons or anything like that. Just a human being. Quiet, patient one. That's what sticks with me the most. Someone made a habit of sitting in that little crawl space, hidden from view, while people lived their lives inches away. And none of them knew.